England, 1809. The first scream was not human at all, but the shriek of a horse dying in the dark. Margot Linwood froze on the back steps of the farmhouse, her hand tightening around the lantern handle. The night had already been a rough one, the sort that pressed low over the fields and made every sound carry strangely. Rain had been threatening since afternoon. Now the wind had risen, prowling around the corners of the stone house and sifting through the hedgerows. She had been about to bolt the kitchen door when that terrible sound tore across the moor. A second noise followed, splintering wood, the crash of something heavy leaving the road, and then, for a heartbeat, silence. Margot set the lantern down long enough to snatch her shawl from its peg. The October air cut through the thin wool of her gown as she stepped out into the yard. Beyond the low stone wall, her fields were nothing but a darker mass against the cloud-thick sky. The rutted lane, a pale ribbon leading toward the market town 3 miles away. No fiddler played at the inn tonight. No wagon wheels clattered late along that lane. Whatever she had heard did not belong there. She vaulted the wall, skirts gathered high in one hand, lantern swinging from the other. Damp earth sucked at her boots as she half walked, half ran toward the road. Years of working the land had given her balance on treacherous ground. Still, more than once, she slipped, catching herself with a muttered oath her father would have pretended not to hear. Viscount Linwood had been gone 5 years. No one pretended anything for her now. The wind carried another sound to her, the harsh, panicked snorting of a horse in agony, then a thud, then nothing. Margot quickened her pace, breath clouding before her. The hedgerow that bordered the lane rose ahead, black and tangled. As she reached it, a faint metallic jangle reached her ear, followed by a weak, frighteningly thin wail. A baby. Margot's heart lurched. She pushed through the gap in the hedge and stumbled out onto the lane. Her lantern threw a narrow pool of light that glistened on wet mud and scattered debris. For a moment, she saw nothing but churned tracks and the jagged shadow of the ditch. Then she lifted the lantern higher. The carriage lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still spinning slowly in the air. Broken harness leather trailed like dead snakes. One horse lay motionless, legs twisted at an impossible angle. The other sprawled across the road, chest shuddering in its last breaths. Glass glittered like frost across the mud. The acrid tang of spilled spirits mingled with the sweeter scent of crushed vegetation and something darker, metallic. Margot swallowed the urge to turn and run back to the safety of her warm kitchen. The baby cried again. She moved forward. The closer she came, the more detail the lantern picked out. The coachman lay near the road, thrown clear by the impact. His hat had rolled away. His head had not survived the meeting with the stone edging. A little farther on, another man in livery lay face down in the ditch water, one hand still reaching toward the carriage as if in some last, useless attempt to protect it. Margot had seen dead animals. She had not seen many dead men. She forced herself not to look at their faces. The carriage itself groaned as its weight shifted, timbers settling. The door that should have opened onto the road now faced the ditch, half buried in the sloping bank. As Margot stepped closer, she realized the window glass on that side had shattered entirely. Through it, she saw movement. A shoulder, the curve of an arm, a glimpse of dark cloth. And beneath that, wrapped in rumpled blankets, a small, writhing bundle that wailed as if the world itself had betrayed it. "Hold on," Margot breathed, voice roughened by cold and fear. "I hear you." "Ye." She left the lantern balanced on a flat stone, its light spilling toward the wreck, then scrambled down the side of the ditch. Mud slicked under her boots and seeped through the worn leather. She braced herself one-handed against the broken carriage frame and reached through the shattered window. The man inside lay sprawled across the bench, body twisted by the force of the crash. It was his arm that pinned the baby, his torso partly covering the tiny form as if he had thrown himself there in the last instant. His hair, dark as pitch, was matted with blood at the temple. In the wavering light, Margot could see the pallor of his skin beneath the smear of dirt. "Sir," she said, voice brisk, despite the pounding of her pulse. "Can you hear me?" He did not stir. The baby's cries rose into a frantic shriek, thin chest heaving. Margot pushed at the man's shoulder, testing how much weight pressed on the child. Her fingers came away sticky. The smell of blood was stronger here, iron and salt, and something she did not have time to contemplate. "Sir, you are crushing the child," she snapped, because anger came easier than fear. "If you mean to save anyone's life tonight, including your own, you must move." Nothing. She gritted her teeth, wedged her shoulder against the broken frame to give herself leverage, and heaved. He was heavy. Not with fat, but with solid height and the dense weight of muscle. The fine wool of his coat slipped under her hands. Something in her back twinged. For a moment she thought she would fail. Then his body shifted just enough. The baby rolled from beneath the fold of his coat, blankets dragging in the shards of glass. Margot caught the tiny form before the child could tumble into the ditch water. The baby's skin felt hot against her cold hands, tears and rain mingling on chubby cheeks. A pair of wide, unfocused eyes blinked up at her, then screwed shut as another outraged cry emerged. "There now," Margot murmured, drawing the bundle close to her chest. The child was heavier than she had expected, solid and real and utterly helpless. "You've a right to complain, I suppose." The man inside the carriage groaned. Margot jerked, nearly dropping the baby. The sound was low, torn from a throat that had seen better days. She adjusted her grip on the child, cradling the small head carefully, then leaned closer to the broken window. "Sir?" His eyelids fluttered. In the dim light she saw long, dark lashes tremble against his cheek. His lips moved around a single word that did not belong to the night or to her. "Catherine." The name lingered in the cold air as his head lolled to one side again. There was no time to wonder who Catherine was, nor why he spoke with the accent of a man who had never worried about the price of bread. Margot stepped back up the incline carefully, each foot placed where the ditch wall seemed least likely to crumble. The baby clung to her with surprising strength for someone so small, fists tangled in the coarse wool of her shawl. At the top she snatched up the lantern and looked back toward the farm. The house stood as it always had, squat and stubborn against the wind, light leaking from the kitchen window where the fire still burned low. Between here and there stretched uneven ground, furrows cut for planting, patches of weeds she had not yet tamed, a stone wall that would need climbing again. She could not carry both child and unconscious man at once. The sensible course would be to run to the village, wake the blacksmith or the innkeeper or the constable, bring help to deal with the wreck, and let them decide the fate of its occupants. But the village lay 3 miles off, and the road between was muddy and dark. By the time she reached anyone, the man's breath might have stopped. The baby's cries already sounded hoarse. Margot Linwood had lost enough people to watch death creep in when she might have held the door. She looked again at the wreck, at the 2 bodies already beyond saving, at the man trapped in the carriage with his blood on the glass, at the baby whose only sin had been to be born into someone else's disaster. Then she hitched the child higher against her shoulder and started back toward the farm at a half run. Inside, her kitchen felt almost indecently warm after the chill of the ditch. The fire on the hearth had burned low, but not out, coals glowing red. She set the lantern on the table, then laid the baby down in a basket she kept for storing potatoes, hastily lining it with a folded blanket. The child flailed, outraged, tiny face scrunching into fresh protest. "Hush," Margot said, more hope than command. "I'll not be long." She grabbed a length of rope from the peg by the door and headed back out into the night. The second trip was worse. By the time she reached the wreck again, sweat prickled at her neck beneath the shawl despite the cold. The horse that had still been breathing was now still. The carriage had settled further into the ditch, groaning as timbers adjusted. The man inside lay as she had left him, chest rising shallowly. "Fool," she muttered, though whether she meant him or herself, she could not have said. With awkward fumbling in the dark, she managed to loop the rope around his torso under his arms, bracing her boots against the ditch edge to drag his upper body closer to the broken window. Every jolt drew a hoarse sound from his throat. Once, his hand flailed weakly, fingers catching her wrist in a grip that surprised her with its force. "Catherine!" he rasped again, eyes still closed. I am not Catherine, Margot said through clenched teeth. And if you do not stop moving, you will bleed out before I have you on solid ground. He did not answer, but his fingers loosened. It took everything she had to haul him from the carriage. Twice she lost her footing and slid back down the ditch wall. Hands scraped raw, breath burning in her lungs. At last, with one final, graceless heave, she got his shoulders over the edge. The rest of him followed in a limp sprawl onto the lane. She paused, bent over with hands on her knees, sucking air. Congratulations, Margot, she told the empty road. You have officially taken leave of your senses. But madness, once embraced, must be seen through. She worked the rope more securely around his chest and shoulders, then began the slow, brutal process of dragging him across the uneven ground toward the farm. He was taller than she had first thought, long legs catching on furrows and stones. More than once she considered leaving him where he lay, going back for help, pretending none of this had ever happened. Each time, she remembered the baby's thin wail and the way his body had been angled over that small form, taking the brunt of the crash. By the time she had him inside and stretched on the narrow bed in the small room off her kitchen, her arms shook with exhaustion. Mud streaked her skirts, blood darkened her sleeves. The candlelight in the chamber flickered across his face as she straightened, giving her the first clear look at him. He was not handsome in the soft, charming way of certain young gentlemen she had known years ago at her father's table. His features were stronger than that. High cheekbones, straight nose, jaw defined with a stubborn line, even in unconsciousness. One dark lock had fallen across his brow, matted now with drying blood. Without that brutal smear, she suspected he would have looked every inch the nobleman his clothes suggested. The clothes themselves were ruined. The coat had torn at the shoulder, the fine wool stained. His shirt clung to his chest where rain and blood had soaked through. She would have to cut it away to see the full extent of his injuries. The baby's cry from the kitchen reminded her that she had 2 lives in her keeping now, not one. Margot left the man long enough to feed the child, warming goat's milk in a small pan and testing the temperature on the inside of her wrist as she had seen village mothers do. The baby latched on greedily to the improvised cloth-wrapped spoon, sucking so hard that milk dribbled from the corners of her mouth. Margot wiped it away with the corner of the blanket, studying the small face. Blue eyes blinked up at her now, clearer than before, framed by wisps of fair hair that lay damp against a round forehead. The child's cheeks were flushed from crying, but otherwise unmarked by the wreck. There was no sign of bruising on the exposed skin of arms and legs, no wince when Margot touched tiny hands. You at least seem determined to survive, Margot said softly. The baby answered with a hiccup and a sigh, eyes drooping as a full belly and warmth did their work. When the child finally slept, Margot laid her gently back in the basket and returned to the chamber. Unbuttoning a gentleman's shirt was not an activity she had anticipated for this evening. She set about it with the same practical briskness she applied to most tasks. The top buttons came easily enough. The rest she had to cut through where blood had stiffened the cloth. She peeled the fabric aside and hissed a little between her teeth. His chest was bruised, especially along one side where the ribs were likely broken. Dark discoloration spread over his shoulder and along his left flank. There was a shallow gash on his upper arm that had bled freely but did not look deep. The worst of it remained the wound at his temple, where skin had split against some unseen edge. The bleeding there had mostly slowed, forming an ugly clot, but the swelling beneath troubled her. She had no surgeon's training. Her knowledge came from watching the old village healer tend her father's final illness and from years of patching up her own smaller injuries. Still, some things were universal. She cleaned the worst of the blood with warm water and a rag, smoothed pungent salve from a jar she kept for cuts, and bound the wounds as best she could. He did not wake during any of it. Once, when she had to turn him a little to tuck fresh linen beneath his shoulders, he muttered a few incoherent words. The name came again, mixed with something that might have been apology, or plea, or curse. Whoever Catherine is, Margot said under her breath, she can address your sentimental ramblings herself when you are fit to walk out of my house, if he lived that long. She checked his breathing one last time before banking the fire in the hearth and returning to the kitchen. The baby slept, cheeks plump against the rolled blanket that served as a pillow. Outside, the wind had shifted, bringing with it a fine patter of rain against the window pane. Margot barred the door. In the morning, she would need to go back to the wreck to see about the horses' bodies, to signal someone from the village to deal with the dead men, to explain as little as possible. She would have to decide how much of the truth she dared share. A carriage with no sign of its crest, a nobleman insisting he had been attacked, a nameless baby placed in his arms. It was the sort of story that would gather interest like snow on a hill. For tonight, there was nothing more she could do but keep watch over the strangers who had crashed, quite literally, into her quiet existence. She set a chair between the bedchamber door and the basket by the hearth, where she could glance from one to the other. Sleep, when it came, would be fitful at best. But Margot Linwood had weathered storms before. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, listened to the breathing of man and child, and waited for dawn. The man did not wake for 3 days. Margot kept him alive through those days with water drip between cracked lips. Broth spooned patiently when his throat worked enough to swallow, and fresh bandages when the ones she had applied turned foul. The fever came on the second night, burning hot enough that she stripped the blankets back and sponged his skin with cool cloths until her arms ached. He thrashed once, nearly striking her across the face, muttering words that made no sense. Catherine, the estate, something about York that she could not catch. The baby, by contrast, proved remarkably easy. She ate when fed, slept when tired, and watched Margot with solemn blue eyes during the waking hours in between. On the afternoon of the second day, Margot fashioned a sling from an old shawl and carried the child strapped against her chest while she worked, one hand free for feeding chickens or hauling water from the well. The rhythm of it soothed them both. She had gone to the wreck at first light after that terrible night, leading the plough horse on a rope in case the carriage team could be saved. They could not. Both animals were dead, stiff with cold and injury. The 2 men remained where they had fallen. Margot covered their faces with her apron and walked the 1/4 mile to the nearest farmstead to send word to the constable. By noon, a cluster of villagers had gathered at the site, murmuring and speculating. Margot told them what little she could. She had heard the crash, found the wreck, brought the survivors back to her home. No, she did not know who the gentleman was. No, she had not found papers or identification. Yes, the baby seemed healthy enough. The blacksmith's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Dawes, had looked at her sidelong. A baby and a gentleman, alone in a carriage at night. Strange business, that. Strange or not, they needed help, Margot had replied, meeting the woman's gaze without flinching. I gave it. The constable, a greying man with a permanently tired expression, had scratched notes on a scrap of paper and promised to make inquiries. He did not sound hopeful. Margot suspected the effort would extend no further than asking at the inn whether anyone had seen a fine carriage pass through in recent days. She returned home to find the baby crying and the man still unconscious. Now, on the morning of the 4th day, she stood at the wash basin scrubbing mud from her work apron when she heard movement from the bedchamber. Not the restless shifting of fever, but something deliberate, the creak of the bed frame, a harsh intake of breath. Margot dried her hands quickly and crossed to the doorway. He was awake, or trying to be. He had managed to push himself halfway upright against the thin pillow, one hand pressed to his bandaged temple, the other braced on the mattress. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dark against blue irises that were still clouded with confusion. When she stepped into the room, his gaze jerked toward her, and for a moment she saw the flash of something sharp and guarded. "Where am I?" His voice came out rough, scraping over the words. "My home," Margot said. She kept her tone matter-of-fact, the way she might have spoken to a nervous animal. "Linwood Farm, 3 miles south of the market town. You were brought here after your carriage wrecked on the road 4 nights ago." He stared at her as if trying to assemble the pieces of what she had said into something coherent. His gaze travelled from her face to the plain walls of the chamber, the single window with its view of fields, the rough-hewn beams overhead. Whatever he had expected to see when he woke, this was clearly not it. "The baby," he said abruptly. "There was a baby." She is well, Margot assured him. Fed and warm. You shielded her during the crash. That likely saved her life. Some of the tension left his shoulders. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again and looked at her with more focus. Who are you? Margot Linwood. This is my farm. Alone? At present, yes. His mouth tightened, though whether in disapproval or simply pain, she could not tell. He shifted his weight, winced, and pressed his free hand to his ribs. How badly am I hurt? Broken ribs, I think, though I am no surgeon. A gash on your head that bled considerably. Bruising across your torso and shoulder. You had a fever for 2 days. She crossed her arms. You are fortunate to be breathing at all. He absorbed this in silence, then asked, The men with me? Dead. Both of them. I am sorry. His jaw worked. For a moment she thought he might speak, but he only nodded once, sharply, and looked away toward the window. Margot gave him a moment, then said, I found nothing in your coat to identify you, save a signet ring with a crest. No papers, no letter of introduction. If you wish me to send word to your family, you will need to tell me who you are. He turned back to her slowly. The guarded look had returned, weighing her with the sort of calculation she imagined men of rank learned early. What did you do with the ring? It is in the kitchen, along with the rest of what I salvaged from your coat before cutting it away to tend your wounds. May I see it? She studied him for a beat longer, then nodded and fetched the small collection of items she had set aside. Signet ring, a leather coin purse still heavy with silver, a folded handkerchief embroidered with initials she had not tried to decipher. She brought them to the bedside and held out the ring. He took it carefully, turning it over in his palm. The relief that crossed his face was brief, but unmistakable. When he looked up at her again, some decision seemed to have been made. My name is William Carver, he said quietly. Duke of Helmsley. Margot felt the floor shift slightly beneath her boots, though she kept her expression neutral. A duke. She had dragged a duke through her fields in the dark and stripped him out of his ruined coat without ceremony. Somehow the absurdity of it threatened to pull a laugh from her throat. She swallowed it down and inclined her head. Your Grace, you did not know. I suspected rank of some sort, given the quality of your clothes. A duke, however, was not my first guess. He studied her face as if trying to determine whether she mocked him. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he said, I am in your debt, Miss Linwood. Mrs. She corrected automatically, then caught herself. That is, it does not matter. You owe me nothing beyond an explanation. His brow furrowed. An explanation? Of why you were travelling with a baby that does not appear to be yours, and why your carriage was set upon in the middle of the night. She kept her voice level. I have told the constable and half the village that I found you. Before more questions come, I would prefer to know what answers I should give. William, Duke, she reminded herself, though the title sat strangely in her mind, looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned his head back against the pillow and closed his eyes. I was returning from York, he said. Business matters that required my presence. The journey should have been uneventful. We were perhaps 10 miles from my estate when we were set upon. By whom? Men on horseback. 3, perhaps 4. I could not see clearly in the dark. He opened his eyes again, staring at the ceiling. They came out of nowhere, blocking the road. My coachman tried to drive past them. There were shouts, the crack of something. A pistol, I think. The horses panicked. Margot waited. In the confusion, he continued, a woman appeared at the side of the carriage. I do not know where she came from. She was on foot, running alongside us, even as the horses bolted. He paused, jaw tightening. She forced the door open, shoved the baby into my arms, and screamed at me to save her from her brother. Her brother? That is what she said. Then she was gone, vanished into the dark. The men were still following. I shouted at the coachman to get us away. He tried. The carriage went too fast on the turn, hit something in the road. The rest you know. Margot absorbed this slowly, picking through the details. The woman, what did she look like? Fair-haired, young, though not a girl. Desperate. He met Margot's gaze, terrified. And the baby? You are certain she is not yours? Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or old grief. I have no children, Miss Linwood. My wife died 2 years ago in childbirth. The babe did not survive. I am sorry. He waved the condolence aside with the faint impatience of a man who had heard it too many times. The child was entrusted to me by someone in need. That is all I know. I do not know her name, nor the woman's, nor why she believed her brother posed a threat. Yet you protected the baby during the crash. Would you have done otherwise? No, Margot admitted. I would not. They regarded each other in silence. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window frame. From the kitchen came the faint sound of the baby stirring in her basket. You said you told the constable in the village, William said carefully. What, precisely, did you tell them? That I heard the crash and found you. That 2 men were dead and you were unconscious. That there was a baby. She paused. I did not mention your title. I said I had found no identification. Why? Margot considered the question. Instinct, I suppose. You arrive in the night with a child that is not yours, attacked by men whose faces you did not see, entrusted with a burden by a woman who vanished. It seemed the sort of story that would draw attention you might not want. You are perceptive. I am practical. There is a difference. William almost smiled at that. The expression transformed his face briefly, softening the hard lines. Then it faded, and he was once again the wary nobleman calculating his next move. I would ask a favour of you, Miss Linwood. Another one, you mean? Yes. He met her gaze squarely. I need time. Time to heal. Time to send word discreetly to my steward and my solicitor. Time to discover who the woman was and why she chose me. If word spreads that the Duke of Helmsley lies wounded in your home with a foundling child, there will be questions I cannot yet answer. Speculation I cannot afford. You wish to remain hidden. For a short while, yes. I will pay you well for the inconvenience. Margot considered this. The money would be welcome. Desperately so. The harvest had been poor, the roof needed repairs, and winter approached with its usual indifference to her circumstances. But there were other considerations. If I agree, she said slowly, and it is discovered that I harboured you without informing the proper authorities, it will be my reputation that suffers, not yours. I have little enough of that left as it is. What do you mean? She shrugged. I am the daughter of a viscount who died in debt and disgrace. I refused an arranged marriage and chose instead to live alone on this farm, working the land myself. The village already considers me odd. Some would say mad. If they learn I kept a duke under my roof for days without sending word, they will add scandalous to the list. William studied her with renewed interest. Yet you are still considering my request. I am considering, Margot said, whether the coin you offer is worth the cost. Name your price. She named a sum that made his eyebrows rise slightly. Then she added, and you will tell me the truth if you discover it. No more half stories, no convenient omissions. If this child is in danger, I deserve to know. Agreed. Margot nodded once. Then you may stay. But understand this, Your Grace. If you bring trouble to my door, I will not hesitate to throw you out, title or no title. Understood. From the kitchen, the baby's fussing grew louder, escalating toward a full cry. Margot turned to go, then paused in the doorway. One more thing, she said without looking back. You kept calling for someone named Catherine while you were fevered. If that is your late wife, you have my sympathy. If it is someone else, you should know you spoke her name often enough that I began to wonder. She left him alone before he could answer. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm Margot had not anticipated when she first dragged William Carver from the wreckage. The Duke recovered slowly but steadily, his colour returning day by day, the hollow look around his eyes fading as proper meals and rest did their work. By the end of the first week, he could sit upright without wincing. By the end of the second, he could walk the length of the kitchen without needing to brace himself against the table. The bandage at his temple had been replaced by a thin strip of linen that covered the healing wound, and the bruising across his ribs had mellowed from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green. He did not, however, leave. True to his word, he had sent word to his estate through a trusted servant, a lean, weathered man named Thomas, who arrived on the third day after William woke, listened to his master's quiet instructions, and departed with the sort of discretion that suggested this was not the first time he had been asked to keep secrets. Thomas returned every few days thereafter, bringing letters sealed with wax and marked with no crest, carrying back William's replies, and never once asking questions that Margot could overhear. In the hours between Thomas's visits, William made himself useful. At first, Margot had objected. "You are injured, Your Grace. You should rest." "I have rested," he had replied, watching her haul a bucket of water from the well. "If I lie in that bed another hour, I will go mad. Then sit in the kitchen and read one of my father's old books. I would rather be useful." She had looked at him skeptically, this tall, broad-shouldered man with his fine bones and hands that had never held a plough, and then shrugged. "Suit yourself. The chickens need feeding. The coop is behind the house." He had gone without argument. The chickens, as it turned out, did not care for him. They scattered when he approached, clucking indignation, and one particularly aggressive hen had pecked his wrist hard enough to draw blood. Margot had found him standing in the middle of the yard, staring at the small wound with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "She attacked me," he had said, as if reporting an ambush by brigands. Margot had laughed, truly laughed, the sound startling in the quiet of the morning. "Her name is Bess. She dislikes everyone. Try not to take it personally." After that, the work had continued. He learned to scatter grain without alarming the flock, to haul water without sloshing half of it down his borrowed shirt, to mend a section of fence that had come loose in the wind. His movements were clumsy at first, betraying a lifetime spent giving orders rather than following them, but he was not afraid of hard work. Sweat dampened his hair. Dirt streaked his hands. Once, when he nearly dropped an armful of firewood, he swore with a creativity that surprised her. "I did not think dukes knew such language," she had observed. "We do not use it in polite company," he had replied, setting the wood down with exaggerated care. "Fortunately, you do not strike me as polite company. I will take that as a compliment." It was intended as one. The baby, whom they had begun calling Grace for lack of any other name, thrived under Margot's care. She had grown plumper in the past weeks, her cheeks filling out, her cries less frantic and more demanding. Margot had fashioned a second sling so that William could carry her when Margot's hands were occupied. The first time she had shown him how to secure the cloth, he had looked at the small bundle against his chest with an expression Margot could not quite name. "She is so light," he had murmured. "She will not stay that way," Margot had replied. Babies grow quickly. Now, on a grey afternoon with rain threatening again in the distance, Margot worked in the kitchen kneading bread, while William sat at the table with Grace balanced on one knee. He was reading aloud from a volume of poetry, something overwrought about nature and the passage of time, but his attention kept drifting to the child, who was gumming the corner of a rag and watching him with solemn interest. "You are wasting your time," Margot said without looking up from the dough. "She does not understand a word of it. She seems to be listening. She is looking at your mouth move. It entertains her." William closed the book and set it aside. Grace immediately reached for it with sticky fingers. He intercepted her hand gently, redirecting her attention to the rag. "How do you know so much about babies?" "I do not," Margot admitted. "I am improvising. But I watched the village women when I was younger, and I am not entirely without common sense." "You are also not married," William said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." Margot dusted flour from her hands and turned to face him. "You said my name was Miss Linwood when we first spoke. I corrected you to Mrs., but that was habit more than fact. I was never married. The title was a courtesy my father granted me when I refused the match he had arranged." William frowned. "Why refuse?" "Because the man in question saw me as a dowry with legs," she said bluntly. "He wanted the land, not the woman. When my father died and the debts came to light, the engagement dissolved itself quickly enough. He did not even bother to write a letter. Then he was a fool." Margot raised an eyebrow. "That is kind of you to say, Your Grace, But we both know the world does not reward women who insist on their own terms. Perhaps not, William conceded, but it also does not reward those who settle for less than they deserve. Spoken like a man who has never had to choose between dignity and survival, he looked at her for a moment. Grace still balanced on his knee, then nodded slowly. You are right. I apologize. The apology surprised her more than the comment had. Margot returned to her dough, punching it down with more force than strictly necessary. Why did you marry? She asked after a pause. Your late wife. Was it arranged, or did you choose her? I chose her. His voice had gone quieter. Or I thought I did. We were young. Too young, perhaps. She was beautiful and kind, and I believed that was enough. It was not? I do not know. We did not have time to find out. He shifted Grace to his other knee, his movements careful. She died within 2 years of our wedding. The birth was difficult. The midwife said the babe was positioned wrong. By the time the surgeon arrived, it was too late for either of them. Margot set the dough aside to rise and wiped her hands on her apron. That is a heavy thing to carry. Yes. She poured tea from the pot on the stove, set a cup in front of him, and took the chair opposite. Grace had begun to fuss, her small face scrunching in the particular way that signalled hunger. Margot reached for her, and William passed the child over with the ease of someone who had done it many times now. Thomas brought more letters today, William said as Margot prepared a bottle. My solicitor has been making inquiries, quietly, as I instructed, and there are whispers. A man named Edmund Fairmont, Lord Fairmont, though the title is minor, has been asking questions in York. Questions about a woman travelling alone with a child, about carriage attacks on the northern roads, about anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Margot looked up sharply. He is looking for Grace. It seems likely. The description matches what little I remember of the woman who gave her to me. William's expression had gone hard. Fairmont has a reputation. Businesses that operate in the grey spaces of the law. Associates who are not particular about how they conduct themselves. If the woman who fled was his sister, she had reason to be afraid. Then Grace is in danger. Potentially. He leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. Which is why I must move carefully. If I simply appear with the child and announce what happened, Fairmont will claim her as his niece. Without proof of wrongdoing, the law will side with a titled man over a foundling in my care. So you need proof. I need evidence that he is unfit, that the woman had cause to flee, that Grace is safer with me than with him. William met her gaze. Thomas is arranging for an investigator, a man I have used before, discreet and thorough. It will take time. Margot fed Grace in silence, watching the baby's eyes drift closed as her small mouth worked. When the bottle was empty, she set it aside and lifted the child to her shoulder, rubbing gentle circles on her back. What will you do with her if you succeed? She asked quietly. Become her guardian, if the courts will allow it. Raise her as part of my household. A duke raising a foundling child. That will cause talk. Let it. There was steel in his voice now. I have endured worse. Margot believed him. She had seen flashes of it over the past weeks. The grief he carried, the guilt that shadowed certain moments when he looked at Grace and saw, perhaps, the child he had lost. Whatever softness he had once possessed had been tempered by loss into something harder, more determined. You care for her, Margot observed. William's gaze flicked to the baby, then back to her. I do, more than I expected to. And when you leave here, when you return to your estate and your title and your responsibilities, I will take her with me. He paused. Unless you would object. Margot blinked. Why would I object? Because you have cared for her as much as I have. More, perhaps. If you wish to remain part of her life, I would not stand in the way. The offer hung between them, unexpected and oddly weighted. Margot looked down at Grace, at the small, perfect face pressed against her shoulder, and felt something tighten in her chest. That is generous, she said carefully. But I am a farmer, Your Grace. I have no place in your world. You have a place wherever you choose to make one. Before she could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the door. They both froze. Margot glanced at William, who had already risen from his chair. his posture shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. She passed Grace to him wordlessly, then crossed to the window and peered through the gap in the curtain. Thomas stood outside, rain beginning to darken his coat, his face grim. Margot opened the door. "Thomas, Miss Linwood." He stepped inside, water dripping from his hat. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but the matter is urgent." William moved closer. Grace cradled against his chest. "What is it?" Thomas glanced at Margot, then back to his master. "Word has reached Helmsley. Lord Fairmont has learned that a carriage matching yours was found wrecked on the road near this village. He is making inquiries. He will be here within days, perhaps sooner." Margot's pulse quickened. "What does he know?" "That there were survivors," Thomas said grimly. "That a woman and a man were seen at the site. That questions were asked, but not answered." He looked at William. "He does not yet know your identity, your Grace. But if he comes here and finds you, he will demand the child," William finished. His jaw tightened. "And he will have the law on his side if I cannot prove he is a danger to her." Margot looked between them. "Then what do we do?" William was silent for a long moment, his hand cradling Grace's small head. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "We prepare. Thomas, send word to the investigator. I want everything he has on Fairmont, no matter how small. If there is proof of wrongdoing, I need it now." "Yes, Your Grace." "And send for my solicitor. Quietly. I will need legal counsel before Fairmont arrives." Thomas nodded and turned to go, then paused at the door. "Your Grace, if I may, Miss Linwood should not be here when he comes. If Fairmont learns she has been harbouring you, he will use it against her." "I am not leaving," Margot said before William could respond. Both men looked at her. "This is my home," she continued, lifting her chin. "I will not be chased from it by a man who frightens women and hunts children." "Miss Linwood," William began. "No." She met his gaze squarely. "You asked me for time, and I gave it. You asked me to keep your secret, and I have. If that man comes here looking for answers, he will find me as unmoved as the stones in my field." William studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing across his face. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "But if it comes to danger, you will let Thomas and my men handle it." "Your men?" "I am a duke, Miss Linwood. I do not travel without protection, even in hiding." He glanced at Thomas. "Send for them. I want this farm secured before Fairmont arrives." Thomas bowed slightly and disappeared into the rain. When the door closed behind him, Margot turned back to William. Grace had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her small fist curled in the fabric of his shirt. "You are certain about this?" he asked quietly. "No," Margot admitted. "But I have learned that certainty is a luxury, Your Grace. We do what we must with what we have. Then we had best prepare for a fight." "Yes," Margot agreed. "We had best." The days that followed Thomas's warning settled into a strange, suspended tension. William's men arrived quietly, 2 of them, dressed as farmhands, who took up positions in the barn and made themselves useful during daylight hours while keeping watch at night. Margot learned their names were John and Peter, both veterans of some campaign she did not ask about, both competent with tools and weapons alike. The work of the farm continued. William had recovered enough strength to manage more demanding tasks, though Margot still caught him pressing a hand to his ribs when he thought she was not looking. They fell into an unspoken partnership. She directed, he followed, and between them the autumn chores progressed. Firewood was split and stacked. The last of the vegetables were harvested and stored in the root cellar. The fence that had been threatening collapse for 2 seasons was finally reinforced. Grace grew more alert each day, her eyes tracking movement across rooms, her small hands reaching for whatever came within range. Margot had fashioned a better sling from sturdy linen, and William wore the child strapped to his chest while he worked, talking to her in that low, steady voice he seemed to reserve for moments when he thought no one else was listening. It was on one such afternoon, with pale sunlight breaking through the clouds and the smell of approaching rain in the air, that something shifted between them. Margot had been carrying water from the well, her arms burning with the effort of the 10th trip. when she stumbled over a root she should have seen. The bucket tilted, water sloshing over her boots and soaking the hem of her skirt. She caught herself with an oath her father would have pretended not to hear, and then strong hands steadied her shoulders. William had appeared at her side without her noticing, Grace sleeping peacefully against his chest. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," Margot muttered, stepping back and trying to wring water from her skirt. "I have walked that path 1,000 times. I should know better." "You are exhausted." His voice held no judgment, only observation. "You have been doing twice the work since we arrived, and sleeping half as much. I manage." "You should not have to." Margot looked up at him, squinting against the light. His face was serious, the wound at his temple now barely visible beneath dark hair that had grown longer in the weeks since the accident. He had lost the polished edge of nobility, somewhere between feeding chickens and mending fences, replaced by something more substantial. "This is my life, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I have managed alone for 5 years. I will manage when you leave." "William," he said. She blinked. "What?" "My name is William. We have been living under the same roof for 3 weeks, caring for the same child, sharing the same meals. I think we can dispense with titles when we are alone." Margot considered this, then nodded slowly. "William, then. Thank you." He shifted Grace's weight slightly, his hand supporting her small back. "And for the record, I do not think you should have to manage alone. Not because you cannot, but because you should not have to." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She looked away, focusing on the water bucket instead. "That is the way of things. Women like me do not have many choices. You chose to refuse a marriage that would have been easier. Easier is not the same as better." "No," William agreed. "It is not." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind stirring the edges of Margot's damp skirt. Then William said, "May I help you carry that water? Grace is asleep. She will not mind the movement." Margot wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it. But her arms ached, and the afternoon stretched long ahead, and something about the way he asked, not as a duke condescending to labor, but as a man offering help to someone he respected, made her nod instead. "Yes, thank you." They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, falling into a rhythm that felt oddly natural. When the water was hauled and the chickens fed and the last repair made to the barn door, they returned to the kitchen to find John waiting with a letter from Thomas. William read it quickly, his expression darkening. "Fairmont has been seen in the village. He visited the constable this morning asking questions about the carriage wreck." Margot's pulse jumped. What did the constable tell him? That there were 2 survivors, a man and a child, but that the man's identity was unknown. "The constable gave him your name as the person who found the wreck." William looked at her. "Fairmont will come here." "When?" "Soon. Perhaps as early as tomorrow." Margot wiped her hands on her apron, forcing herself to think clearly. "Then we need a story. Something that will satisfy him without revealing who you are. Or we tell him the truth and let him make his claim," William said, though his tone suggested he liked the idea no better than she did. "And lose Grace to a man who drove her mother to desperate flight." Margot shook her head. "No, we need more time. The investigator has found something," William continued, scanning the letter again. "Evidence that Fairmont's business dealings are not as legitimate as they appear. Fraud, possibly extortion. But it will take days to gather enough proof for a magistrate to act. Then we give you those days." Margot crossed her arms, thinking. "When Fairmont comes, you are not here. You are a traveller who was injured in the wreck and has since moved on. The child was found abandoned near the site, and I have been caring for her until the parish can arrange proper placement. He will not believe you. He will have no choice if you are not here to contradict it." She met William's gaze steadily. "You said you had men. Send them with you back to Helmsley. Let them guard you and Grace there while Fairmont wastes his time questioning me. I am not leaving you to face him alone. I am not asking you to. John and Peter can remain here, out of sight, but close enough to intervene if needed. And I am not without resources of my own." William looked at her for a long moment, clearly torn. Grace stirred against his chest, making a small sound of protest before settling again. The sight of them together, this powerful man cradling a helpless child with such careful tenderness, made something warm and painful unfurl in Margot's chest. "I do not like this plan," William said finally. "Neither do I, but it is the best we have." He was silent, then sighed. "If I agree to this, you must promise me something." "What?" "That if Fairmont threatens you in any way, you will send word immediately. John knows how to reach me, I promise. And that you will not take unnecessary risks." "Define unnecessary." "Margot." His voice had gone serious, all pretense of lightness abandoned. "I am asking you to trust me to handle this once I have the evidence I need. Do not provoke a man like Fairmont. He is dangerous." "I know that," Margot replied. "But so am I when circumstances require it." Despite the gravity of the moment, William's mouth quirked slightly. "I believe you." They prepared through the evening. William packed what little he had brought, arranged for Thomas to arrive before dawn with a horse, and reviewed the plan with John and Peter until all three men were satisfied. Grace was fed and changed, and bundled into fresh blankets, her small face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the danger circling closer. As night fell and the household settled, Margot found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching the darkness beyond the glass. Behind her, she heard William's footsteps. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be difficult. I'm not tired." "You are a terrible liar." Margot smiled despite herself. "Perhaps, but I find sleep elusive when I am uncertain what the morning will bring." William moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air. "For what it is worth, I have faith in you. You are one of the most capable people I have ever met." "Capable," Margot repeated. "What a romantic compliment." "I did not mean it as—" He stopped, then laughed softly. "You are mocking me." "Only a little." They stood together in comfortable silence. Outside, an owl called from the direction of the barn. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters. "Margot," William said after a while, his voice low, "when this is over, when Fairmont is dealt with and Grace is safe, I would like to speak with you about something." She turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden seriousness in his tone. "What about?" "The future. Yours, mine, Grace's." He met her gaze. "But not tonight. Tonight there are too many uncertainties." "All right," Margot said, though curiosity pulled at her. "When it is over, then." William nodded. For a moment he seemed about to say something more, then thought better of it. Instead, he simply touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of reassurance perhaps, or solidarity, and turned to check on Grace one last time before they both retired. Margot lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, listening to the wind and the creaking of old wood and the distant sound of John's footsteps as he made his rounds outside. She thought about William leaving before dawn, about facing Fairmont's questions alone, about the child who had arrived in her life so suddenly and would leave just as quickly once this was resolved. She thought about the way William had looked at her in the fading light, and what he might have meant by speaking of futures. But mostly, she thought about tomorrow, and steeled herself for whatever it would bring. Fairmont arrived 3 days after William left. The dawn of his departure had been a quiet, hurried thing. Thomas appeared in the half-light with 2 horses, their breath steaming in the chill air. William had Grace bundled against his chest, the baby blinking sleepily, unaware that her world was about to shrink to the unfamiliar walls of Helmsley. John and Peter stood by the barn, watchful shadows in the grey. "You know the plan," William said, his voice low. "If Fairmont comes, I was a nameless traveller, and I am gone. Grace was found alone. You took her in out of charity." Margot folded her arms to keep from reaching for the child. "And you will gather proof." "I will." He hesitated, then added, "I will send word the moment I have something solid. Until then, do not trust anyone who mentions Fairmont's name." "I rarely trust anyone who mentions any nobleman's name," she replied, trying for lightness she did not feel. William's gaze searched her face, as if committing it to memory. "Take care of yourself, Margot. You as well." For a moment it seemed he might say more. Instead, he stepped closer, free hand lifting as if to touch her cheek. At the last second, he altered the gesture, his fingers brushing her shoulder instead. "If he so much as raises his voice to you, William said, and there was steel in him now. Remember that he is a man already standing on a crumbling precipice. He just does not know it yet. I will remember. Then he swung into the saddle with an ease that belied his recent injuries. Thomas mounted beside him. The two men turned their horses toward the road, and in a matter of heartbeats, they were little more than dark shapes slipping into mist. The farm felt emptier for their absence, though Grace had left the day before with Lady Philippa's maid, a necessary precaution, William had said, to ensure the child was well hidden before Fairmont drew too near. Margot had no children in the house, no Duke in her spare room, only the creak of old beams and the familiar complaints of her joints as she went about the day's chores. The emptiness did not last. On the third day, just after noon, the sound of carriage wheels drifted down the lane, measured, confident, nothing like the chaotic approach that had shattered her peace weeks before. Margot wiped flour from her hands, took a steadying breath, and stepped onto the front step. The carriage, that rolled to a stop before Linwood Farm, was a glossy dark green, its crest polished bright on the panel, 3 falcons on a shield, framed by curling leaves. 2 matched bays stood in the traces, flanks gleaming, heads tossing impatiently. A coachman in neat livery sat atop the box, poker-faced. The man who stepped down from the carriage was not tall, but he carried himself as if he were. His hair, once fair, had begun to thin at the temples, though it was arranged carefully to disguise the loss. His clothes were impeccable, navy coat, waistcoat of cream silk, boots polished to a mirror sheen. A ring flashed on his finger as he adjusted his gloves, the stone a rich, arrogant red. Lord Edmund Fairmont did not look dangerous in the way of men who wield knives or pistols. He looked dangerous in the way of men who wielded paper and influence and a certain sort of charm, the kind that made people underestimate them until it was too late. Margot clasped her hands before her, holding herself steady. He smiled as he approached, the expression smooth and practiced. "Miss Linwood, I presume?" "You presume correctly, my lord." She did not curtsy. The omission was deliberate. If he noticed, he chose not to comment. "Edmund Fairmont." He inclined his head. "I must apologize for intruding upon you without prior notice, but I am told you are the lady who found a carriage wrecked on the road some weeks past." "I am. I understand there was a child involved." Fairmont's gaze swept the yard, the house, lingering on the closed barn door, the fields beyond. "I have great interest in that child." "Do you?" Margot kept her tone flat. "My sister," Fairmont said, and for the first time there was something almost human in his expression. "She was travelling with an infant. They have been missing. I have reason to believe the baby is my niece." Margot thought of the report William had shown her, the witness who had spoken of a quarrel, of a woman's scream, of a blow delivered in anger. "Your sister?" "Yes, Lady Clara Fairmont." His jaw hardened, though whether with grief or some other emotion, she could not tell. "She has been unwell for some time. Impulsive. She left our father's house under distressing circumstances. You can imagine my concern when I learned her carriage was found overturned, its occupants scattered." "There were no women at the wreckage," Margot said. "Only 2 men, both dead." His eyes sharpened. "No sign of a lady? No body recovered later?" "None that I saw." The constable searched the surrounding fields. If there was a lady, she did not die there. Fairmont's fingers flexed at his side, the only crack in his composure. "And the child?" Margot had prepared this answer. She delivered it now with steady calm. "I found a baby near the carriage, alone. I took her in. And where is she now?" "With the parish nurse," Margot said. "The vicar came when he heard. He said the church would see to her until more permanent arrangements could be made. A foundling." Fairmont's lip curled faintly. "The child of some nameless woman consigned to charity. It is better than leaving her in a ditch," Margot replied coolly. He gave a tight laugh. "Quite. You are a woman of strong opinions, Miss Linwood. I am a woman who has seen what happens when the vulnerable are left to the mercy of those who view them as inconveniences." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. She saw frustration there, but something more as well. A calculation, the measuring of an obstacle he had not expected. "I do not mean to quarrel with you," Fairmont said, smoothing his voice. "I am simply a man looking for his own flesh and blood. If the child you found is indeed my niece, I would be willing to provide handsomely for any expenses you incurred in caring for her. Your generosity is noted. Margot folded her arms. But I have already turned her over to the church. If you wish to claim her, you may petition through the magistrate like anyone else. Annoyance flickered openly now. The magistrate will take my word on such matters. The magistrate, a new voice said from behind Fairmont, will take the law into account, Lord Fairmont, regardless of whose word is offered. The constable had arrived, his familiar stooped figure coming up the path with surprising speed. Behind him walked a man Margot recognized, but had never spoken to. The local magistrate, Mr. Harding, his wig slightly askew, his eyes sharp. Miss Linwood, Harding said, inclining his head. Lord Fairmont, I hope I am not interrupting. You are right on time, Fairmont replied, the smile back in place. I was just explaining my situation to Miss Linwood. So, I gathered. Harding looked between them. You believe the child she found to be your niece? I do. And you wish to take custody of her? Of course. I am her closest male relative. Harding's gaze shifted to Margot. Miss Linwood, you confirm that you found the child and that she has since been placed with the parish nurse? I do, Margot said. She is in the vicar's care, as we agreed. And you have no objection to Lord Fairmont's claim, should he prove his relation? Every instinct in Margot screamed that she should object, that she should stand between this man and the child with all the force she could muster. But she also knew she could not simply denounce him without evidence. William needed time to gather that proof. If she drew too much attention now, she might ruin everything. I have no right to object, she said carefully. The child is not mine. If Lord Fairmont can show he is better suited to care for her than the church, that is for you and the vicar to decide. Harding nodded slowly. Spoken sensibly. Lord Fairmont, you will present whatever documentation you have to my clerk this afternoon. Baptismal records, family correspondence, anything that proves the existence of this supposed niece and her connection to your household. But of course, Fairmont's smile had grown strained. I am happy to cooperate. In the meantime, Harding continued, you will not harass Miss Linwood. She has done her duty and more in this matter. Any suspicions you may hold about her motives are baseless until proven otherwise. I hold no suspicions, Fairmont said smoothly. Only gratitude that she found the child at all. He bowed to Margot, the gesture precise. You have been most helpful, Miss Linwood. I hope we may meet again under more pleasant circumstances. I hope not, Margot replied. For a moment, something like amusement flashed in his eyes, quickly masked. He turned on his heel and walked back to the carriage, speaking softly to the coachman. Within minutes, the horses were turned, and the glossy vehicle rolled back down the lane. Harding watched it go, then turned to Margot. You did well. Did I? Her legs felt hollow. I just told the truth. You told enough of the truth, Harding corrected. Sometimes that is the best one can do, the constable coughed. Miss Linwood, if you ever feel unduly pressured by him or anyone else in this matter, you come to me. I may not have much, but I have a cell and a key, and I am not afraid to use them. Thank you, Margot said. They left her then, promising to keep her informed. She watched them go, the weight of what she had not said pressing against her ribs. Inside the barn, John stepped from the shadows. He did not suspect. Not yet. Margot sank onto an overturned crate, suddenly weary. But he is not a man to accept obstacles gracefully. Then we make sure we are not merely obstacles, John said. We are walls. William's first letter arrived that evening. Thomas brought it under his coat, the paper slightly wrinkled, but the seal intact. Margot took it with hands that shook more than she liked and waited until she was alone in the kitchen to break the wax. Margot, the letter began in William's precise hand. By the time this reaches you, Fairmont will have come. I trust your judgment and your courage, but it still costs me to be absent. Know that I am working every hour to make that absence temporary. He went on to explain in careful detail what he had learned in the short days since his return to Helmsley. The investigator had uncovered records of debts Fairmont had purchased at a fraction of their value, then used to squeeze small landholders out of their properties. One such debt, William noted, matched the sum Margot's father had owed at the time of his death. "He owns your debt on paper," William wrote, "but the manner in which he acquired it is questionable. My solicitor believes we can have those documents challenged, perhaps even voided, if we can show that the original contracts were obtained under duress or through misrepresentation." He also described a witness, a former servant in the Fairmont household, who had come forward with a story that made Margot's skin crawl. A quarrel between Lord Fairmont and his sister, voices raised, a threat spoken in anger. The servant had seen Fairmont strike Lady Clara. Days later, she and the baby were gone. The official story had been that she left of her own accord. "With this testimony," William wrote, "combined with the pattern of his dealings, we may be able to convince a magistrate that Fairmont is unfit to care for any child, niece or otherwise. But it will require courage from those who speak against him. Men like Fairmont do not surrender power quietly. You were right to keep my name from the villagers at first," he added in a smaller, tighter hand. "Your instincts protected us long before any title could." At the end of the letter, his tone shifted, softened. "I think of you often," he admitted, "of your kitchen, your fields, the way you stand as if the wind itself would break around you before it could move you. Grace is safe for now. She sleeps in a cradle that belonged to my mother. Lady Philippa dotes on her shamelessly. Everything in me insists that you should be here, that we should face this together. But I know that your place, for now, is where you are. That does not mean I like it." He signed his name with a flourish that seemed somehow more personal than any title could have been. Margot read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the box where she kept her father's papers. She stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, listening to the tick of the cooling stove, the distant murmur of the men in the barn, the echo of carriage wheels long gone. Fairmont had come and left without seeing Grace. He had looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved or a tool to be used. William, in his letter, had written of her as if she were a partner. The lines between those two men, and the futures they represented, had never seemed clearer. Margot blew out the candle, letting darkness fold around her. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the wreck, she felt not merely like a witness to other people's battles, but a combatant in her own right. "Tomorrow," she told herself, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her bed. "Tomorrow, we keep going." William kept his promise. Over the next fortnight, letters arrived at steady intervals, each one carried by Thomas with the same discreet efficiency. Margot learned to recognize the sound of his knock, the firm, measured rhythm that announced not only his presence, but news from a world she had never expected to touch. In those pages, written in a hand she had come to know better than she liked admitting, William charted the progress of his campaign against Edmund Fairmont. The investigator had done his work thoroughly. He had traced a pattern of predatory lending that made Margot's stomach twist. Small landowners offered lifelines in the form of loans, only to find themselves ensnared in impossible terms, their properties stripped away when they inevitably failed to repay. Among those names had been her father's, confirmation of what William had suspected. Fairmont had not merely taken advantage of misfortune, he had cultivated it. "My solicitor believes we can argue that the debts were obtained through unconscionable means," William wrote. "If we succeed, not only will your land be fully yours, but Fairmont's web may begin to unravel." There was more. The servant who had witnessed that terrible quarrel between Fairmont and his sister had agreed to testify, though fear had nearly silenced him. William described the meeting in careful detail, the man's trembling hands, the way his gaze darted to the door, as if expecting Fairmont to burst through at any moment, the relief and terror mingling in his eyes when he finally spoke the truth. "He struck her," the servant had said. "My lord, he struck his own sister. She was holding the baby. She said she would tell what he had done with the money, that she would go to your steward if he did not stop. He said he would see her ruined before he let that happen." Days after that confrontation, Clara had vanished with her child. Fairmont had told neighbours she had gone to the country to recover her health. No one had questioned him. Now William meant to force those questions into the open. Back at Linwood Farm, Margot's life settled into a wary routine. Fairmont's visit to the parish had not yet resulted in Grace being taken from the vicar's protection, a fact that owed more to Harding's cautious insistence on proper process than to any lack of effort on Fairmont's part. The magistrate, perhaps sensing the shape of something larger, had chosen to delay any decision until William's solicitor could present his evidence. "He may be a duke," Harding had said when he called at the farm to explain, "but he is the one bringing me documentation, Miss Linwood. Until I see it, I am not placing a child with a man whose temper is the subject of whispers." Margot had thanked him, relief loosening a knot she had not realized she carried in her chest. Even so, the tension did not ease entirely. Fairmont remained in the area, appearing at the inn, the church, the homes of anyone who might have glimpsed the wreck or the people involved. His presence was like a splinter lodged under the skin of the village, small perhaps, but impossible to ignore. He came once more to Linwood Farm, riding alone this time, his coat dusted with the pale grit of the road. "I wish to speak to you without the magistrate hovering," he said when she met him in the yard. "Man has all the subtlety of a barn door." Margot leaned against the well, arms folded. "What is there left to discuss, my lord?" "My niece. Or rather, the child who may be my niece." His smile did not reach his eyes. "You have become quite the topic of conversation, Miss Linwood. A gentleman from Helmsley has taken an interest in you. A duke, no less. Curious company for a farmer's daughter." Margot held his gaze evenly, her heart thudding once, hard. "Is it so strange that those who value justice should find common cause? Is that what you call it?" Fairmont's tone sharpened. "Carver meddles in matters that do not concern him. He thinks his title makes him untouchable. You say that as if it frightens you." He laughed once, a short, humourless sound. "Nothing frightens me, Miss Linwood, but interference annoys me, and when I am annoyed, I remove the source of the irritation. I am not a stone in your boot, my lord," she said. "I am a woman who found a child in a ditch and chose not to leave her there. If that inconveniences you, perhaps the fault lies not with me, but with whatever put her in that ditch." For a moment, the mask slipped. She saw anger there, cold, controlled, but very real. "You should be careful where you place your loyalty," Fairmont said quietly. "Men like Carver do not keep their promises to women like you. They use you until it suits them to do otherwise." "I will take my chances," Margot replied. "You may speak to the magistrate if you have further claims. Until then, you are trespassing on my land." His jaw tightened. "You will regret this stubbornness." "Perhaps, but I would rather regret courage than cowardice." He stared at her a heartbeat longer, then turned his horse without another word. As he rode away, John emerged from the shadow of the barn, hand resting lightly on the butt of the pistol hidden beneath his coat. "If he had reached for you," John began. "I know," Margot said. "Thank you." "His kind prefers paper and influence to pistols," John said. "But cornered men make foolish choices. Best we end this before he feels the walls closing." Ending it required more than courage and insults. It required the dull machinery of the law to grind into motion. It began with a summons. Thomas brought that as well, the folded parchment bearing Harding's seal. William would be presenting his evidence in person at the magistrate's hall, and Margot was requested, politely but firmly, to attend. "You are a key figure," Harding told her when she arrived. The hall smelled of ink and dust, the wooden benches worn smooth by years of disputes. "You found the child. You have dealt with both men involved. Your testimony will carry weight. I am no scholar of law. You are a scholar of truth." Harding's eyes met hers. "Say what you saw. Say what you know. Leave the rest to me." William's presence in the hall drew every gaze. He wore dark, sober clothes, the only concession to his rank, a signet ring on his finger, and the effortless authority in his bearing. Lady Philippa sat beside him, chin lifted, her gaze sweeping the room with a hawk's sharpness. Grace, Margot knew, remained at Helmsley under the care of a nurse. The absence of that small, warm weight made something in Margot ache. Fairmont sat at the opposite table, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. He looked less composed than he had at the farm, a faint sheen of sweat at his hairline. Harding laid out the matter with commendable clarity. The question before them was twofold: whether Edmund Fairmont's business practices constituted fraud sufficient to void certain debts, and whether his character and conduct rendered him unfit to act as guardian to his alleged niece. The investigator spoke first, presenting ledgers and letters, patterns of lending and default that painted a picture of calculated exploitation. William's solicitor followed, explaining the legal principles at stake. The servant who had witnessed Fairmont strike his sister told his story, voice trembling but steady. Fairmont's lawyer objected often. Harding overruled him more often. When Margot's turn came, she stepped into the small space before Harding's desk and felt every eye on her. William's gaze, steady and reassuring, met hers across the room. She did not look at Fairmont. "Miss Linwood," Harding said, "will you recount for the record how you came to be involved in this matter?" She did. She described the scream in the night, the wreckage in the ditch, the dead men and the living man and the crying baby. She told them how she had dragged the unconscious stranger to her home, how she had cared for the child. She did not mention William's title until Harding asked, and then she spoke it clearly, anchoring his presence in the story as something that had happened, not some romantic fantasy the gossips in the village had woven. "And Lord Fairmont?" Harding asked. "Describe your interactions with him." Margot recounted his visits, the polite mask, the veiled threats, the way he spoke of his sister and the child as if they were both property gone astray rather than human beings in danger. She repeated his warning that he removed irritants when annoyed. Fairmont's lawyer objected to that characterization. Harding waved him down. "I heard him," Margot said. "So did my farmhand. You may ask him yourself." Through it all, she kept her voice steady, her spine straight. She did not embellish. She did not omit anything that mattered. When she stepped down, William's eyes followed her back to her seat. There was pride there, and something warmer. Fairmont's defense was, in the end, thinner than he had likely expected. He painted himself as a concerned brother, a man of business perhaps too trusting of those he dealt with. He denied striking Clara, suggested the servant had misinterpreted a common family quarrel. As for the debts, he insisted they had been acquired legally. "The law allows it," he said, spreading his hands. "If men sign contracts, they must abide by them. I cannot be blamed if fortune does not favor them." "The law also allows hanging," Harding replied dryly. "Its presence on the books does not make it a desirable end." By the time arguments concluded, the air in the hall felt thick. Harding retired to his chamber with a stack of papers and a furrow in his brow. The room buzzed with whispers. Margot stepped outside for air. The courtyard behind the hall was small, bordered by a low wall and a patch of hardy shrubs that clung to life in the thin soil. She stood with her back to the stone, drawing in deep breaths, letting the cool air clear her head. Footsteps approached. For a moment she braced herself for Fairmont. Instead, it was William. "You were remarkable," he said simply. "I told the truth. Not everyone does when men like Fairmont are in the room." She studied him. Up close, she could see the lines fatigue had carved at the corners of his eyes. He had been carrying not only this fight, but the weight of his estate, his position, Grace's safety. Yet he still looked at her, as if her presence here mattered deeply. "How is she?" Margot asked quietly. "Grace. She is well." The tension in his shoulders eased at the mention of the child. "She has discovered that she can roll from one end of the nursery rug to the other, and she does so with great determination. Lady Philippa swears she will be walking before her first birthday. She seems the sort to do exactly as she pleases, much like someone else I know." Their eyes met. For a moment, the noise of the hall and the weight of the proceedings fell away, leaving only the two of them in a small, sun-dappled space that smelled faintly of earth and ink. "If Harding rules in our favor," Margot said, breaking the quiet, "what then? For Grace? For the debts?" "If he voids the debts, your land is safe," William replied. "Fairmont will lose a significant source of income and leverage. As for Grace, if he declares Fairmont unfit, we can petition for me to be named her guardian. We, Yes, we. His gaze did not waver. I do not intend to do this alone, Margot. Not anymore. She felt as though the ground had shifted again, though in a different way than it had when she first learned his title. William. He stepped closer, careful to keep a respectful distance. I meant what I wrote in my letters. You are not a temporary ally or a convenient witness. You are... He broke off, searching for words that would not cheapen what he felt. You are the person I think of when I make decisions now. That is not something I say lightly. Before she could answer, the hall door creaked open. Harding's clerk stuck his head out. They are ready for you, Your Grace, Miss Linwood, Lord Fairmont. The three of them gathered again in the main room, facing Harding's desk like supplicants before an altar. The magistrate's expression gave nothing away. I have considered the evidence presented, he began. It is my judgment that Lord Fairmont's lending practices, while perhaps distasteful to some, do not meet the strict legal definition of fraud as it stands. The debts, including that of the late Viscount Linwood, are therefore valid in principle. Margot's stomach lurched. William's jaw clenched. However, Harding continued, raising a hand, there is sufficient indication that these debts were acquired through methods that skirt the edge of what this court will tolerate. I hereby order a full review of all such contracts by a higher judicial body. Until that review is complete, all collection efforts on those debts are to be suspended. No land, including Linwood Farm, may be seized in satisfaction of said debts. Fairmont stiffened. You cannot. I can, Harding said. And I have. He shuffled the papers, then picked up another sheet. As to the matter of guardianship, it is clear from testimony that Lord Fairmont has, at best, a volatile temperament. The account given by the servant regarding his treatment of his sister is deeply troubling. While not sufficient on its own for criminal conviction, it suggests a household environment that may be unsafe for a child. He looked directly at Fairmont. Until such time as a higher court rules otherwise, you are barred from seeking legal custody of the child known as Grace. Given her current placement and the involvement of the Duke of Helmsley, I find it appropriate that his petition for guardianship proceed. William inclined his head. You have my gratitude, Mr. Harding. You will have my continued attention, Your Grace, Harding replied. Guardianship is not a title. It is a duty. See that you remember that. A murmur ran through the hall. Fairmont's face had gone pale with fury. His composure cracked at last. This is an outrage, he hissed. You allow him to steal my blood from me on the word of a farmer's daughter and a disgruntled servant. I allow nothing, Harding said coolly. I apply the law. If you have further complaint, you may take it to London at your own expense. The proceedings dissolved into formalities after that. Papers to sign, notices to file, arrangements to be made. Fairmont left in a storm of muttered threats. William, after speaking briefly with Harding, turned back to Margot. It is done, he said softly. For now, she replied. He will not forget this. Nor will I, William said. When the review of the debts is complete, I will see to it that every man Fairmont has wronged has his day, starting with your father's legacy. Margot exhaled slowly, the weight that had pressed on her since her father's death easing for the first time. He would have liked you, she said, though he would have pretended otherwise at first. I hope in time you will like me enough for the both of you. The words hung between them, not a jest, not entirely serious either. An invitation, a beginning. Come back to Helmsley with me, he said, the decision clearly made while Harding spoke. Not as a witness, as someone Grace already knows from the sound of your voice, as someone He stopped, then continued more carefully, as someone I do not wish to leave behind on a half-resolved battlefield. Margot looked past him, through the open door, to where the road curved away toward her farm. Linwood had been her prison and her refuge in turn. It had been the last piece of her father, the site of her stubborn independence, the stage on which she had faced down a lord who thought he could crush her. It was also, she realized, no longer the sum total of her world. I cannot answer that standing here, she said honestly. I need to see the farm with this new knowledge, that it is safe, that his hand cannot reach for it, and decide who I am when I am not fighting to keep it. William nodded. Then we will go there first. You, and I, and Grace. His eyes warmed at the last name. We will stand in your fields and see what the future looks like from there. And if I decide my future is there, and not at Helmsley, then I will have to learn to like the smell of chickens, he said. I meant what I said, Margot. I am done making decisions that do not account for you. It was not yet a declaration of love, but it was a declaration of something. Respect, commitment, the willingness to weave their paths together, rather than force one to bend entirely to the other. For the first time since a screaming horse had shattered a quiet night, Margot allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by loss or defense, but by choice. Very well, William, she said. Let us go home. The carriage back to Linwood felt different with William in it. Margot sat opposite him, the worn leather creaking beneath her weight, the familiar hedgerows and fields passing beyond the small window. She had travelled this road countless times, into town for seed or salt, to church on rare occasions, but never with a duke's signet glinting in the dim light across from her, never with the sense that the ground she was returning to was no longer under threat. Grace lay in a wicker basket on the seat beside Margot, fast asleep, one small fist pressed against her mouth. They had fetched the child from Helmsley first, as William had promised. The reunion had been unexpectedly rough on Margot's composure. Grace had blinked at her for a heartbeat, as if trying to place this familiar stranger, then reached out with a delighted sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. You see, Lady Philippa had said, watching them with a sharp eye moist at the corners. She remembers her. Babies know who has held them through storms. Now, as the wheels jostled over ruts in the lane, Grace's cradle rocked gently. Her breathing stayed steady, unfazed. You are quiet, William observed. Margot tore her gaze from the window. I am thinking. A dangerous habit, he said lightly, then sobered. About what? About standing in my kitchen and not wondering when a man like Fairmont will come with papers and demands. About planting next spring's seed without calculating whether the harvest will go to my table or to his coffers. About what it means, she added more softly. To choose to stay rather than cling because I have nowhere else to go. If you choose to stay, William said, it will not be because you have nowhere else. You have Helmsley now. You have me. He hesitated, then added, if you want us. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching. That is what we are going to Linwood to decide. The carriage rattled over the shallow dip, where the lane crossed the small stream that marked the edge of her land. When they emerged on the other side, the view opened in a way Margot's bones knew as intimately as her own hands. The patchwork of fields, the small orchard, the squat stone farmhouse weathered by years of wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. John and Peter had clearly kept the place running in her absence. The driver drew the horses to a halt in the yard. William stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand. Margot took it, boots hitting the packed earth with a solidity that grounded her in a way nothing in the magistrate's hall had managed. Home. She breathed it in, the smell of damp soil, of chickens somewhere behind the house, of wood smoke and old stone. It was not grand. It was not what the world considered impressive, but it was hers. Grace's basket was handed down next. Margot lifted the child into her arms. Grace blinked against the light, then focused on Margot's face and reached for her with that same determined little hand. She has decided, William murmured. You belong to her. I am not sure who rescued whom, Margot said. John appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Miss Linwood, Your Grace. Just Margot here, William said. And only if she allows it. Margot almost smiled. We will see how long you last before forgetting yourself and answering to Your Grace anyway. They walked the perimeter of the fields first. Margot's choice. She needed to see the boundaries with her own eyes, to walk the lines her father had walked, to feel the certainty that no one would come to claim them under colour of law. This strip, she said, pointing to a narrow piece of land that ran along the stream. Fairmont tried to use it against us, claimed the survey markers were wrong, that our boundary cut into his cousin's property. My father fought him over it for years. And now? William asked. Now, Harding's order means he cannot touch it until the review concludes, Margot said. And your solicitor believes that review will find fault with how he acquired everything tied to those contracts. My solicitor is not a man given to optimism, William replied. If he says the case is strong, I believe him. But even if some part of the debt remains, I intend to see it satisfied in a way that does not involve you losing a single stone from your wall. What? She stopped, turning to face him fully. You do not owe me that. No, he said. I owe your father that, and Clara, and every other person Fairmont tricked. You. I owe something else entirely. There it was, the opening she had both anticipated and dreaded. William, she began, but he held up a hand. Walk with me a little more, he said. Let us see your house from the far field. I find truths look different when viewed from a distance. They climbed the slight rise beyond the last tilled plot. From there, Linwood spread below them like a worn but beloved shawl, patched in places, rough at the edges, yet undeniably whole. When I first woke in your guest room, William said after a long silence, I did not know where I was, only that I was alive, and that someone had gone to great trouble to make it so. I assumed, if I am honest, that a man like me would be found by people accustomed to serving men like me. Yet there you were, not a servant, not a supplicant, a woman who had made a world for herself out of the remnants of someone else's ruin. That is a flattering way to describe stubbornness, Margot said. It is an accurate way to describe strength. He looked at her. I have estates, Margot. Lands and houses and tenants whose names I try to remember. I have titles and obligations, and a seat in a chamber where men argue for days, over whose pride matters more. I thought that was all my life would be, duty and the echo of a grief I did not know how to set down. His gaze softened. Then you dragged me out of a ditch, scolded me for bleeding on your floor, and told a lord to his face that you would rather regret courage than cowardice. I have been altered since. She swallowed. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair at the edge of Grace's blanket. The baby made a small, contented sound against her chest. You are asking me to be part of that altered life, Margot said. To leave this and go to Helmsley as more than a guest. I am asking you, William said, to marry me. The words landed with the weight she had known they would, heavy with possibilities and dangers both. For Grace's sake, she said slowly, testing him. For our sake, he replied. I can be her guardian without making you my wife. The law would permit that now, but I do not want a life in which you stand apart from the decisions that shape her world, or mine. You are offering me a place among people who think I am beneath them, Margot said, who will whisper about the farmer's daughter who trapped a duke with a child in a scandal. They will whisper, William said. Some will sneer. A few will extend polite cruelty in the guise of concern. They did the same when I married Catherine. She was an earl's daughter, and still they found fault. They will always find fault with something. The question is whether we let their opinion dictate our happiness. And if I say no, he did not flinch, then we will remain allies. You will keep Linwood, free of Fairmont's shadow. Grace will visit you so often that she will think of this place as another home. I will stand between you and anyone who tries to take what is yours, and I will hope, quietly, that one day you change your mind. The simplicity of it disarmed her. No ultimatum, no suggestion that she owed him anything for what he had done. Only a choice, laid bare. You would split your life between Helmsley and a small, drafty farmhouse, she said, because a woman too stubborn for her own good cannot bring herself to leave her chickens. He smiled then, that rare, unguarded smile she had seen perhaps twice before. I have grown fond of your chickens, and your stove, and the way you stand at this very spot when you are thinking, grinding your heel into the earth as if daring it to move. She looked down. He was right. Her boot had pressed a shallow groove into the dirt. When my father lost everything, she said quietly, I swore I would never again tie my future to a man's promise. Promises did not keep food on the table. They did not stop debt collectors or gossip. They did not keep him alive. I cannot promise you a life without pain, William said, or without gossip. I cannot promise that I will not make mistakes. But I can promise that when storms come, I will face them beside you, not from a distance. That when choices must be made, your voice will carry as much weight as mine. That I will not leave you to drag bodies out of ditches alone. The image of that night rose in her mind. The weight of his body, the scream of the horse, the feel of Grace's small form in her arms. She had not been afraid. Not exactly. She had simply acted because there had been no one else. The idea of not being the only one anymore, that was new. Frightening in its own way, but not in the manner she had always assumed. When I look at Helmsley, she said slowly, I see a world that would rather pretend I do not belong. When I look at Linwood, I see a world that tried to push me out and failed. If I say yes, I need to know I will not be expected to erase the second to fit into the first. William stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw where he had cut himself shaving. A small, human imperfection. If you say yes, I will expect you to bring Linwood into Helmsley, he said. To remind me, when I start to forget, that titles are ash if they are not used to shelter those without them. To make my grand echoing rooms feel like your warm, overcrowded kitchen. That is asking a great deal, she said, though her voice had softened. I am asking a great deal, he agreed, and offering as much in return. A soft coo from Grace drew their attention downward. The baby had woken, blue eyes wide, gaze flicking between Margot and William as if sensing that something important hung in the air. You hear this? Margot asked her softly. Your Duke is making promises. Our Duke, William corrected. If you choose. Margot looked from the child to the man, then back to the land that had been her entire world. She thought of 5 years of holding everything together alone. She thought of the weight of not having to anymore. All right, she said quietly. Yes. William did not whoop or sweep her off her feet. He simply exhaled, a breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for weeks, and reached out as if to touch her cheek. His hand hovered for a heartbeat, giving her the chance to step away. She did not. His fingers brushed her skin, calloused now from work on her farm, and the gentleness of it undid her. May I kiss you? He asked. Margot smiled. I suppose that is customary when a woman agrees to marry a man. He leaned in, his mouth meeting hers, not with the desperate hunger of a man claiming a prize, but with the tentative reverence of someone recognizing a home. The kiss deepened slowly, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. When they broke apart, Grace made a small noise of protest at being ignored. You are not the only one learning to share, Margot murmured. They returned to the house with the decision made, but the work only just beginning. There were practicalities to address, bans to be posted, arrangements with the vicar, questions of where the ceremony would be held. Lady Philippa arrived 2 days later, her carriage raising a small cloud of dust on the lane, and declared that no niece-in-law of hers would be married anywhere but in a proper church, even if she did insist on wearing boots to the rehearsal. Society did what society always did. News travelled fast. Some called the match romantic, the Duke and his farmer bride, as if it were a story spun at an inn to warm cold nights. Others sniffed, suggesting Margot must have trapped him, that no man of sense would willingly align himself with a woman whose dowry was a stubborn streak and a patch of land. Margot heard the whispers at their first small gathering in town together, felt the weight of eyes on her plain gown and calloused hands. She also heard, just as clearly, the way William introduced her. My fiancée, Miss Margot Linwood, he said, with pride and no hint of apology. The woman who saved my life. See, if some of the ladies of the county found that inconvenient to their narrative, that was their problem. At Helmsley, the staff adjusted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, was reserved at first, but thawed when Margot joined her in the kitchens one morning to discuss supplies and menus rather than issuing decrees from above. The steward appreciated Margot's practical questions about tenants and harvests more than he would have admitted. A few footmen smirked behind their gloves when they thought she could not see. They stopped when she caught one dropping ashes on the front step and handed him a broom. Your future Duchess has opinions. Lady Philippa observed dryly. Someone must, Margot replied. Grace adapted with the ease of the very young. She split her time between Linwood and Helmsley, equally at home in both. At the farm, she crawled across the kitchen floor and tried to eat feathers. At the estate, she toddled along the corridors, tiny fingers leaving prints on polished wood, her laughter echoing off high ceilings. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock of their engagement softened into something steadier. The review of Fairmont's debts moved slowly through the legal channels, but Harding wrote periodically to inform them of progress. Each letter confirmed that the edifice Fairmont had built was crumbling. On a cool morning 6 months after the magistrate's ruling, Margot stood once again at that familiar rise above her fields, watching the sun burn mist off the furrows. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly. William stood beside her, Grace perched on his shoulders, her delighted squeals punctuating the quiet. You were right, Margot said. About what? William asked. Truths do look different from a distance. She rested her head briefly against his arm. I thought I knew exactly what my life would be. I am glad I was wrong. So am I, he said. They had not yet faced London's full scrutiny. That would come with the next season, the invitations and balls and the inevitable parade of people eager to see the Duke's unconventional Duchess. But Margot no longer feared that as she once might have. She had walked into a magistrate's hall and spoken truth in the face of a man like Fairmont. She had stood in a field and argued with the Duke until he saw reason. She had dragged her future out of a ditch with her own hands. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The child arrived in the quietest hours of the night, when snow pressed against the windows and Helmsley held its breath. Margot had insisted on labouring in the Duchess's chambers, rather than being moved to a smaller, warmer room. My mother bore 3 children in this room, William had told her months ago, running his hand across the carved bedpost. If you wish it, this can be where our son or daughter enters the world. She had chosen it, not out of sentiment, though that had played a part, but because the chambers were vast and well appointed, the fireplace broad enough to heat the space properly, and the bed positioned so that the midwife and physician would have room to work without tripping over one another. Now, as dawn turned the snowlight grey, William paced the corridor outside, listening to sounds that made his hands shake. He had promised himself he would not give in to the fear that had gripped him since the pregnancy became undeniable. He had promised Margot he would trust in the physician she had chosen, a sober man from Edinburgh with modern ideas about hygiene and pain management. He had broken those promises approximately an hour into her labour, when the first cry of true pain had slipped past her iron control. Lady Philippa sat in a chair by the corridor window, embroidery in her lap, though her needle had not moved in some time. Sit down, William. You will wear a trench in the floor. I cannot. You can. Margot is in capable hands. Catherine was in capable hands, he said, voice raw. It did not save her. Lady Philippa set her embroidery aside. Catherine's labour went on for 2 days before the surgeon was called. The midwife was old and set in her ways. The babe was breech, and no one realised until it was too late. She rose and crossed to him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. This is not the same. Margot is strong. The physician is competent. You must have faith. I am trying. Try harder. The door opened. William spun, heart in his throat, but it was only the midwife stepping out to fetch more linens. She saw his face and softened. She is doing well, Your Grace. Truly. It will not be much longer. When the door closed again, William sank into the chair Lady Philippa had vacated and buried his face in his hands. He had survived battlefields, at least the legal ones. He had faced down lords who believed their wealth made them untouchable. He had rebuilt an estate from neglect and rescued a child from the clutches of a man who would have twisted her into something cruel. None of it had prepared him for this. The helplessness of standing outside a room where the woman he loved fought a battle he could not join. The cry, when it came, was thin and furious and unmistakably alive. William was on his feet before he realised he had moved. Lady Philippa gripped his arm, holding him back. Wait, let them finish. It felt like hours. It was likely minutes. When the door finally opened, the physician emerged, sleeves rolled to his elbows, face lined with fatigue but smiling. "You have a son, Your Grace, and your Duchess is well." William did not remember crossing the threshold. He only knew that one moment he was in the corridor, and the next he was at Margot's side. She lay propped against pillows, hair dark with sweat, face pale but eyes bright. In her arms, wrapped in linen that had been warmed by the fire, was a tiny, red-faced creature, making surprisingly loud complaints about his sudden eviction into the cold world. "He has your lungs," Margot said, voice hoarse but amused, "and possibly your sense of timing. Could not wait for a reasonable hour." William knelt beside the bed, hand trembling as he touched the baby's small fist. Immediately, impossibly, the tiny fingers curled around his own. "He is perfect," William whispered. "He is very angry," Margot corrected. "But yes, perfect." The physician approached, gently checking both mother and child once more before nodding his satisfaction. "Rest now, Your Grace. Both of you have earned it." When the room had emptied, save for them and the midwife, who busied herself tidying in the corner, William looked at Margot with something he could not name. Gratitude, awe, relief so profound it hurt. "I thought I had lost you," he admitted. "For a moment, when I heard—" "I know." She reached for his face with her free hand, brushing her thumb across his cheek. "But you did not. We are both here, all three of us." "Four," came a small voice from the doorway. Grace stood there, holding Lady Philippa's hand, her nightgown wrinkled from sleep, eyes wide and curious. She was nearly 2 now, sturdy on her legs, her fair hair a riot of curls. "Come here, little one," Margot said softly. Lady Philippa lifted Grace onto the bed with care. The child approached the bundle in Margot's arms cautiously, then leaned forward to peer at the tiny face. "Baby?" Grace asked. "Yes," William said. "Your brother." Grace considered this, then reached out to pat the baby's head with surprising gentleness. The infant's cries quieted, replaced by a soft, snuffling sound. "He likes you," Margot observed. Grace beamed. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. The boy, named James after William's grandfather, proved to have both his mother's stubbornness and his father's tendency to wake at ungodly hours. Grace adapted to her new role as elder sister with a seriousness that made the staff hide smiles. She would stand by the cradle, reporting dutifully whenever James cried, as if Margot and William might somehow have missed the noise. Fairmont's legal troubles concluded during James's 3rd month. The review found sufficient evidence of fraud and coercion to void nearly every debt he had acquired through questionable means. Those who had lost land were given first opportunity to reclaim it. Margot's father's debt vanished as if it had never existed, the papers destroyed in a magistrate's fireplace. Fairmont himself had fled to the continent before the final ruling. His estate seized to pay restitution. Word reached them months later that he had been seen in Paris, living in reduced circumstances, still trying to rebuild the empire he had lost. "Do you feel vindicated?" Lady Philippa asked Margot one afternoon as they sat in the Helmsley Gardens, Grace chasing butterflies nearby while James dozed in his mother's arms. "I feel relieved," Margot said. "Vindication suggests I needed his downfall to feel whole. I do not. His absence is simply quieter." "You are wiser than I was at your age," Lady Philippa observed. "Or more exhausted. It is difficult to tell." The London season, when it came, tested Margot in ways she had anticipated and some she had not. Society had heard the stories, the Duke who married a farmer's daughter, the mysterious child they had adopted, the scandal with Lord Fairmont. Curiosity brought people to Helmsley's London residence in droves. Some came with genuine warmth. Others came to assess whether the rumours were true, whether the new Duchess of Helmsley was truly as unsuitable as they had heard. Margot met them all with the same steady grace she had used to face Fairmont. She did not pretend to be something she was not. When Lady Hartwell, one of the most influential patronesses in London, asked about her background, Margot answered plainly, "My father was Viscount Linwood. He died in debt. I worked his farm for 5 years before circumstances brought the Duke and me together. How singular, Lady Hartwell murmured. How practical, Margot replied. Someone had to eat. The room had gone quiet. Then Lady Hartwell laughed. A genuine, delighted sound. I like you, Duchess. You have spine. After that, the whispers changed. Not entirely. There would always be those who found fault. But enough that Margot's presence at events became less a spectacle and more an accepted fact. She did not forget where she had come from. That autumn, she launched a project in consultation with several other ladies, a fund to assist widows and orphans, particularly those left vulnerable by the sort of predatory lending Fairmont had practiced. The work was unglamorous, reviewing applications, arranging placements, ensuring money reached those who needed it. But it was real. William supported her without hesitation, contributing both funds and his name to lend the project legitimacy. You see, he said one evening as they reviewed the month's accounts. Titles are useful when wielded properly. I still think chickens are more honest, Margot replied. But I will concede your point. Grace thrived. By her 3rd birthday, she had declared herself an expert on all matters related to her baby brother, and had begun asking when the next sibling would arrive. Not for some time, Margot told her firmly, though the look she exchanged with William suggested the topic was not entirely closed. Linwood Farm remained in their lives, not as a relic, but as a living part of their family. They visited often, sometimes for weeks at a time, especially during the planting and harvest seasons. Margot taught Grace to scatter seed, just as she had once taught William. James, when he was old enough, would toddle through the furrows, delighted by mud and chickens in equal measure. The staff at Helmsley learned to pack for these trips without complaint, though Mrs. Bell never quite understood why a duchess would want to spend her time elbow-deep in a vegetable garden when she had gardeners to do such work. Because it is mine, Margot had said simply, and I choose not to forget that. One evening, as the sun set over Helmsley's grounds and the children played on the lawn under the watchful eye of their nurse, Margot and William stood together on the terrace. Do you ever regret it? William asked. Leaving Linwood for this. I did not leave it, Margot corrected. I brought it with me. There is a difference. There is, he agreed. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. I think of that night often. The storm, the crash, the way you appeared out of the dark like some fierce, practical guardian angel. I think you are romanticizing a woman hauling a bleeding stranger through mud. Perhaps. He smiled. But that woman saved more than my life. She saved the idea of what my life could be. Margot leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Below them, Grace shrieked with laughter as James tried to catch her, his chubby legs pumping. The air smelled of roses and cut grass, of smoke from the kitchen fires, of home. I used to think, she said quietly, that strength meant holding on when the world tried to pry my fingers loose. I did not understand that sometimes strength is knowing when to reach for something new. And are you glad you reached? She looked up at him, at the man who had appeared in her life as a nameless burden and become something far more complicated and necessary. Every day, the stars began to appear, faint against the deepening blue. Inside, someone lit candles in the windows. Helmsley glowed, warm and solid, a place that had learned to hold both a duke's authority and a farmer's practicality within its walls. Margot thought of her father, who had loved this land even as it broke him. She thought of the girl she had been, standing on a hill and swearing she would never again depend on a man's promises. She thought of the woman she had become, not because she had abandoned that girl, but because she had learned that some promises were worth the risk. Come, William said, tugging her gently toward the door. James will be demanding his supper soon, and Grace will want a story before bed. Our evening awaits. Our evening, Margot repeated, tasting the words. Ours. Not his, not hers, but something they had built together from wreckage and stubbornness, and a baby who had arrived in the dark with no name and no future. They had given her both. In return, she had given them a reason to become more than they had been. As they stepped inside, Margot glanced back once at the fields beyond the terrace, the road that led eventually to Linwood, the night gathering softly over everything. She had dragged a duke from a ditch. He had pulled her from a life of fighting alone. In the end, they had both been saved. And that, Margot thought as she closed the door on the stars and the darkness, was enough.